you already know, I love getting into the weeds and learning about the nuts and bolts of the music business, not only presently, but also back in the past. How did things work? I'm not a musician, I'm not a recording engineer, but I sure love hearing about how it all happened back in those days. And if you're the same way, then you're going to absolutely love this book. It's called Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios. And it's written by Martin Porter and David Goggin. And those two guys are amazing. They've done work for all sorts of different magazines and record companies and things of that nature. One of the magazines being even Rolling Stone magazine. And so these guys have credibility. It's not like somebody that doesn't really know what they're talking about. These guys know. In fact, I think David had said he was a studio rat. And so he'd been in a lot of studios. But one of the most iconic studios in rock and roll history was the record plant. And that wasn't just one location. It was New York City, LA, and Sausalito, California, which is up in Northern California. These guys, oh my gosh, the work they put into this, it was a 10-year effort to get this book written and published. And boy, I tell you, if you like the nuts and bolts and the behind the scenes stories of albums that were made, and we're talking the big albums, the albums you and I grew up listening to, that we wore out, that we told everybody to hush when their songs came on the radio, the albums that we loved reading the liner notes to. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about here. So if you love that kind of read, I encourage you to buy this book, because I'm telling you, it's a page turner. I absolutely loved it. And Marty and Dave are great people to talk with. I could have talked with them for 4 or 5 hours easily, and that may still happen. You never know. So again, if you love the behind the scenes stuff of some of the greatest music ever made, buy Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios, because it's going to be a great addition to your library. While you're listening or watching to this interview, please hit like and please subscribe. Neither one's going to cost you anything, but it helps Boomerocity out tremendously. And also share it with your friends, especially your music-loving friends that love the history of this stuff. So without any further ado, here is my interview with Marty Porter and Dave Goggin, who wrote Buzz Me In. Until next time, this is Randy Patterson with Boomerocity. Take care.
Good afternoon.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Likewise.
I like your wallpaper.
Just a little biased, aren't you?
That's great. I gotta get a handle on that. See, you can see over in my or how do I point?
Over your shoulder?
Yeah, it's down there, the book.
Yeah, I see it off to you. It'd be off to your left, I guess, over on the.
Yeah.
Hey, I'll be happy to send this to you. It's real simple. It's just I created it, digitally, of course, and I'll be more than happy to send you a copy of it.
Excellent.
So you can use it, and let's see, Marty too, right? So
yeah, he'll be here.
okay.
If he screws up, I'll text. No, I got his cell number right here.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is because these things sometimes can take memories, I've learned the hard way that I can gum up an inbox pretty heavily. I try to send links to where you can download it. That way your inbox doesn't get full up. Because I get these press releases and such, and they've got these high res pictures, and before you know it, I've got to clear out my inbox and everything because these pictures are taking up so much space. So
yeah.
I try to be mindful of that for others on the other end of my emails,
How long have you been doing this?
Well, I am in my 17th year.
Wow.
I started out doing it, and I figured, quite honestly, I would be, in and out in a year. But it was really I started the website to showcase some other kind of writing, kind of introspective, like, kind of like a reflections of a baby boomer type of thing. And
Yeah.
I thought I'd do the occasional interview. Well, I ended my first year doing 25 interviews. So I thought I might be onto something here. So Marty, how you doing?
Nice to meet you, Randy. How are you?
I'm
Nice.
doing
We love
great.
you. We love your background. We love your
Yeah,
background.
yeah.
He's going to send it to us.
Yeah. So you guys can use it anytime you
Thank you.
want. My gift to you for giving me a great read, man. Gosh, I want to reread it because I had to go through it a little fast,
Yeah.
But it was when Ben told me about it, and I meant to get with him earlier. Anyway, long story short, he sent me the PDF of it, and I was like, "Whoa, this is great stuff, man! I love it, absolutely love it."
Well, it
Where are you
only
guys
took us
clicking
10
in from?
years to write it. And
Really? 10 years. Wow.
yeah, we started 10 years ago when Chris Stone was still among the living. And he, up until the very end, he called me Bonds. I called him the Stone Man. And he goes, Bonds, when is the book done? Come on. What are you guys waiting around for, So it was that long ago. He was still bitching about it, but um, it took. I'm glad it took that long. I wouldn't exactly like to do it again, but I think it gave us much more, and it had to take that long to do it.
You said you wouldn't want to do it again. Was Marty that hard to work with?
No, no, no. I mean, I don't think I have 10 years right now to devote to that kind of thing. Oh,
I
no,
hear
no.
you.
Marty and I are a team, totally.
Cool.
I knew Stone for half of my life, started working with him. I don't like to say for him, but back and forth when actually the studio was still there on Third Street, and it was kind of getting a little rickety in its old age. And he wanted me to convince people that everything was going to be cool. The new place was going to be great. The tradition would continue. So that's where it started for me.
Well, before we get further on this, where are each of you guys clicking in from?
I'm in Hollywood, the entertainment capital of the world.
And I'm in New
Wow.
York. I'm in New York.
Wow. Boy, you guys really do have this long distance thing figured out, huh? So,
Well, if you think about it, it works because New York is where Record Plant started.
Mhm.
It had a long, illustrious career beyond, even after Stone and his partner moved out to L.A. and built an outpost. Sausalito was always an outpost of L.A. in their minds.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, I've worked with a lot of people doing what I do. I was just saying that before you jumped on that, I've been at this. I'm in my 17th year doing this, and it's always been a labor of love. It's slowly monetizing, but I didn't think it would last more than a year. But at the end of my first year, I had 25 interviews, and that's not what I set out to do was the interviews. But I thought, two or three interviews, the occasional interview, put my creative writing out there. After a year, I'll figure out nobody was interested and I'll shut it down. Well, 25 interviews with people like Ace Frehley and Rob Parisi of Wild Cherry and Rick Derringer and Edgar Winter and Johnny Winter. I thought, I think I'm on to something here. So I stuck with it, still at it and having a lot of fun.
Glad you did. I saw you had just done the thing about the Billy Joel documentary and I also see that you have Bob Gruen's photos up on the on your website. Yeah, so
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about taking those videos and converting them into shorts for the YouTube channel. But Bob he's so kind to that for 2 years. He was giving me monthly, episodes to do. And gosh, what a legend, right?
yeah. He was also equally kind to us with our book. That's for sure. A lot of his books. I think over 20 of his photos are in the book. So
Wow. My goodness. Well, I've only read it from a PDF. In fact, what I'd love to do, and I'll pay you guys for it, is I'd love to get a signed hard copy of it from you guys if that's doable. I don't know if
No
it is.
problem. Just get us your, send Ben your street address. We'll take care of that.
All right, super. Well, you guys are clicking in from the coast, and as I was saying earlier, I absolutely love this book. I'm a fan. I'm not a musician. I've never been a professional in the industry. I guess some people consider that I am now, and I don't really know how to take that, but
Just take it.
yeah. Well, as long as they don't call me a journalist, I guess I'll be
Yeah.
okay, right? So, no, Marty, you were the one that was with Rolling Stone, right?
I did a lot of work for Rolling Stone over the years, yeah, and was a columnist for Rolling Stone for a while, and doing audio. I was always on the technical side of the entertainment business, and
Ah,
worked for Rolling Stone. And then when Bonds and I started working on this project, we were fortunate to get a couple of features in Rolling Stone about
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
plant. So it certainly gave us our launch, and the magazine's always been good to us, and always been core to what I've been writing about.
cool.
Yeah,
And
I did some
Bonzo,
photos for Rolling Stone. I'm on the West Coast and pretty much been working with the bigger studios out here for many, many years as a photographer and as an interviewer.
very cool. Very cool. How's that? Yeah, I hear so much from different people, and we will get on this book, I promise you. But the, the industry's changed so much. I mean, back when we were all younger and all that, I mean, it was a completely different world, as your book reflects, when it comes to the recording side. But how has all of that changed for you guys in the work you do and how you could make a living? What's been the biggest, best, and worst changes, in other words, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think the good news about the boomers and the fact is this music was more than just the boomer music. I have a niece who's just going to college, and I said, "Hey, start a TikTok channel for our Record Plant Diaries, which we do on Facebook." And so we've been putting up some TikTok videos, right,
Mhm.
from the book, and we're getting hundreds and hundreds of followers and likes on TikTok. And I said to her, what's the story? I said, we love that music too. This music was not just for the boomer generation. This music has lasted, and the stories lasted, and the legends have lasted. And we're fortunate. I think our generation is especially fortunate that this music has legs, so to speak.
Yeah. How about you, Bonds?
Well, I'm still doing pretty much what I do. I take photos, I go to studios, I cover kind of what's going on out here in Los Angeles, and writing about it. Um, and you know, I've photographed a studio on last Friday. A friend of mine's just opened it up. It's not as big as Record Plant, but you know, it's a real studio, and it's got all these stuff that is important in a studio, and that type of world is really diminished now. So much of it can be done on a computer with a microphone in your bedroom. But the thrill of actually going into a studio is still there. It's serious. It can be very serious, and you have to pay attention to acoustics and a lot of things that are not available in a home. This is a smaller studio, but it still has a big recording room, and it's got a real console. It's got a nice ambiance, and I just love doing it. I got the bug many, many years ago when I my first step into a studio was Abbey Road as a guest of John Lennon. And
Whoa.
you just don't get over that. I was going to school in Scotland, the University of Edinburgh, and I lucked out, and I'd been involved in some experiments in biofeedback, and John took a liking to that information and
Mhm.
invited me to the studio. And it's still a thrill. A few years ago, I was waiting to take a photo of Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson. Christopherson was producing, and he was given, he wanted to get the best out of Willie. And I'm standing outside the vocal booth with my camera and tripod waiting. I really didn't mind waiting to hear take after take as Willie sang it again and again. That's the thrill to me that's never diminished since that first time at Abbey Road. I'd never been in a studio before, and I had no idea that I would spend the rest of my life involved in studios. And like you, I'm not a musician, and I think that kind of that isolation from their world helped me in documenting what people are doing in the studio. And then to go through this history of the record plant, reliving it actually in many ways. So we're giving you a viewpoint that's really an inside story. That's why it's called Inside the Record Plant Studios. We had access to artists and engineers and producers. And in many cases, the stories that you read in this book were told by the people that were not the star. Maybe the star was concentrating on getting his song done. These other people that were the support crew are the ones that really have the better memories of what's going on. I mean, if it was the first time you're recording Bob Dylan, you remember every detail, and it's embedded in your consciousness forever. And we got to those people, and we got their stories, and luckily, we got to them before they passed away. And in the course of writing this book, many of the great storytellers are no longer with us. So we're so glad that we got to them and got their story to kind of piece together what it meant in those days to be a recording studio. It was a complicated mechanism. It relied on, the woman at the front desk, the traffic lady, who could juggle, Fleetwood Mac in one room and Sly Stone in another, and oh no, Sly's late. Oh God, Frank's coming in. Oh no, what are we going to do now? And keeping that rolling, because the artists don't want to know about any of those problems. They just want to have the first class opportunity that they paid big money for.
I think if you take it to the beginning, it was a technology revolution in the 60s. We look about it as being a cultural revolution. We look at it as being a political revolution, but it was a first technology revolution. And it was a time when, well before computers and well before video and certainly well before AI, what was the technology that was the big change? It was audio. Audio was the first real big technology revolution of this generation. We all bought stereos. Those of us could afford a stereo, right? And hi-fi, and it was a big time. And on the professional side, similar things were taking place, because to feed the demand for vinyl and the demand for a more immersive sound of stereo, they had to build these rooms where you could, and along came big tape machines, multi-track tape machines, and consoles, and big, with lots of controls on them that needed to be figured out. And you had to take the acoustic environments that had been around for a long time. Studios had been around for a long time, but build them in a way that you can isolate the artists and record them on multi-track tape machines. This was all taking place in the mid 60s. And that brought a whole new generation of engineers, technicians. They were the first tech bros, well before the Silicon Valley guys came along. These were the tech bros, and they fell in love with audio, just like this current generation is falling in love with social media and AI. This, looking back 60 years ago, it was technology that made this happen. And along came a whole new generation of young people who weren't musicians like us, and they may not have been, they weren't journalists, but they loved the music and they wanted to get close to the artists, and they wanted to help them capture the sound. If they loved technology, they went to audio. And our story begins in 1967 when one of those guys, a guy named Gary Kellgren, was working in a studio in New York that was one of the first studios with an 8-track tape machine in New York. Right? Remember, Sergeant Pepper was recording on a 4-track. All right,
Yep.
and we're talking a year later. There's an 8-track. All right, so one of the first 8-tracks in New York is in a small studio on 7th Avenue called Mayfair, and there's a young kid from corn country out in the Midwest who's made his way to New York, and he fell in love with being an audio engineer. So here he is working in the summer of love in '67 in the studio, right? His name's Gary Kellgren, and he's got a mentor, a producer named Tom Wilson, who had just worked with Dylan, had just worked with Simon and Garfunkel, and that summer he was working with Velvet Underground, Lou Reed on an album that became White Light, White Heat. He was working with Frank Zappa on an album that became We're Only in It for the Money. And a friend of his named Chaz Chandler just so happened to be managing an artist named Jimi Hendrix who needed a studio that summer. So he brought Hendrix in to work on a couple of songs. Kellgren's working on all 3 of those at the same time. And Kellgren built a reputation, and he built and Hendrix fell in love with him. Right? They all fell in love with Kellgren because Kellgren served the artist. He had a couple of things. One, he knew how to mix crazy psychedelic sounds with an analog tape machine. Remember, this is the early days of audio, right? Long before digital. And you had to be able to know how to shake up and move the tape and get those psychedelic sounding phasing. It was called phasing sounds.
And flanging
Kellgren
and
got
all
that
that.
down. Kellgren got that down. He got it down with Eric Burden on an album called Sky Pilot. And Hendrix heard that and said, wow, I want those sounds from that guy. Well, he was making those sounds happen. And they were all trained, like Kellgren, like everybody else, was flipped out by Sergeant Pepper's and learned what George Martin was doing with the Beatles, and that changed everything. And so did Pet Sounds with the Beach Boys. But Kellgren took it to the next level, and because Hendrix fell in love with him, Hendrix had done some work over in London on his next album at Olympic Studios, and he was looking for a room in New York. Right? Where can I do it? And I said, does this kid Kellgren have a studio? No, he was just an engineer. But he ran into this guy named Chris Stone, and Kellgren and Stone said, by the way, I got business. I could fund this with some business from this great big artist named Jimi Hendrix. And with Hendrix booked, Kellgren and Stone went off and built the first record plant, which opened in the spring of '68. And the first album, the first client was Jimi Hendrix, and the first album was Hendrix's biggest album with his biggest hit, Electric Ladyland, and biggest hit, all along the Watchtower. That's how it all began. It all began in the spring of '68 with Hendrix in New York.
So it sounds like for the artist, they're looking for not only quality of sound, obviously, because they had to enjoy it, and if they enjoyed it, then maybe the fans would. But they needed some place where they could chill as well, and that was one of the big selling points of. And I use the word chill very broadly.
Yeah.
Well, we won't go into any details or anything, or maybe
I
not
just thought of
all
something that Chris Stone often said to me when he got into situations and he didn't know where it was going to go and how they were going to do it. And then somebody had these strange requests, and Stone's always came up with this. He said, well, whatever floats your boat. And
but I think it's important to point out that studios were around for a long time. They tended to be owned by the big labels. They
were big rooms.
Big rooms.
yeah.
They were union run. So if the tape operator, if you're rocking and rolling and the tape operator wants to go for lunch, he shuts down for lunch, you lose the groove, right? You lose the energy. And the record label executives were there looking, peering down your back and listening to everything and putting their 2 cents in, right? Well, this was a different era, right? It was the era of giving the artist more freedom, giving them more space to create. And with that, they didn't want the union shops. They didn't want those tape operators to shut them down. They wanted to record. Hendrix wanted to record through the night. He wanted to be able to bring in people, and yes, he wanted to use any recreational substances and that he might be able to get his hands on or to inspire him. So
Playrooms.
it led to a whole new generation of studios that were independent, that served the artist, didn't serve the label, and gave them a private, safe, creative environment where they could make their music.
And also at this time, the studios were in competition with each other. And the artists, I like to liken it to the Renaissance when different painters were competing against each other. And one would discover that there's this new pigment that is coming from Egypt or something. The first guy to get that special blue or whatever. The first guy that discovered, the optical things that could enhance accuracy in painting. Competition was severe in those days between the studios to stay ahead of each other. And Record Plant really shined in that department because they had, Marty likes to call it art and commerce. Well, Kellgren was the creative genius, the guy who could mix a bunch of stuff that was just pouring into the control room. And the guys would come back and listen to it and they were just amazed that he could do this and that their engineer could do it better than somebody else. And Chris Stone knew how to stay ahead of the game with the equipment. I think some of it started when he discovered he was just had to make a big hit, and he's going to go get a new car. He goes to the Mercedes showroom to get the latest, and his license plate said deduct, and Kellgren's license plate on his Rolls Royce said greed. But anyways, talk to the guy. He says, and the salesman says, well, you don't have to buy it. Did you ever think about leasing a car? And this is all new business type of stuff. And bingo, Stone goes, why, I can lease these $100,000 tape machines. And the competition continued with him always ahead of the crowd to satisfy Kellgren's lust for audio. And it really was a hunger that made his name and made the studio's name and made the studio the place where, look, if you want to look at the Billboard charts, here's the top 10. Oh my God, look where they were recorded. Well, I want to go there too. Yeah. So that's part of the story.
Randy, your listeners will appreciate this. They'll go back to your old vinyl collections. Let's start randomly pulling the albums off the shelf, right? And look at those tiny credits in 6-point type, in the back. You know what? There were so many Record Plant credits that it's amazing. And those little 6-point type credits really meant a lot to those engineers, right?
Oh yeah.
But if you look back, historically, everybody knows. Hey, name a famous recording studio from that period, right? Everybody will say, Abbey Road, right? Not every studio can have an album by the Beatles named after them, right? That's right. That makes it number one, right? Number two will inevitably be Electric Lady Studios, which was this studio that Hendrix built after he left Record Plant. Again, right. Famous, but there's, we would claim that Record Plant may have been the largest, most significant studio of the era. It's not, what other studio ties together, starts with Jimi Hendrix, ties together Stevie Wonder's entire classic period, right? John Lennon's entire post-Beatles catalog, Bruce Springsteen's biggest records, Born to Run and Darkness on the Edge of Town, Sly Stone, Aerosmith, Kiss. You can keep going. Virtually every major artist of the 70s worked on there. And if you pull out those albums, you'll see those credits. Now, if you go back to Hendrix, though, it's really important to note that Hendrix was in love with Kellgren. He was in love with the studio. But his business guys were in love with making money off of Jimi Hendrix. And Hendrix wanted a private place to work. He wanted space. They decided to build their own studio. And Electric Lady Studios still exists on 8th Street in New York, still in a recording institution, and did some amazing work over the years. But Jimmy only worked there for about 10 weeks before he died.
Yep.
The two
Yep.
years prior, all the posthumous records that came out after his death were recorded mostly, almost entirely, at Record Plant.
I want to
And
come back to that in just a moment because I don't want to forget about something that I think is kind of important to bring up because the record plant, its launch came, like I said, from what you guys have shared in your book, the pursuit of the perfect sound and the big sound and the loud and all that. And I'm sure that back then, tell me if I'm wrong, but back then they thought, all right, we have arrived. It doesn't get any better than this. The best you can hope for is maybe not blowing the speakers. I know you've got some great stories in there. But I fast forward to 2 weeks ago. I'm interviewing Louis Maldonado, the new lead singer for Foreigner, and they're re-releasing Foreigner 4. Okay, and he's talking about how they're I can't remember now what it is, but it's Dolby something.
Atmos.
And it starts with an A. Yeah.
Atmos.
And he said he heard that album in this room with that new sound in there, and he was loving it. He said, man, I got to get this for my place. And then he priced it. He goes, I can't get this for my place, but we're still in pursuit of the perfect sound. Will we ever get there?
Well, listen, I have an opinion about that. Everybody's opinion. We all talk about high definition television and video being the ultimate and film being the ultimate art form. But, think about it, and I'll talk in a very simple idea. Video and film enter your body and they don't touch you. They enter through your eye. It's light comes into your eyes, right? Music touches your body. It tingles you. It goes through your ears. It creates a physical sensation that's you can't compare to, and what you're talking about is Dolby Atmos, which is one of the latest forms, right? In the early days of Record Plant, it was stereo. Record Plant was one of the first studios to pursue quad, although that never really happened in the early days. All of the Stevie Wonder albums were recorded in 4 channels, and Stevie did it specifically in all the classic Intervisions, Talking Book, songs in this Key of Life are all recorded in quad because Stevie liked that sensation of being in the studio surrounded by the music. All right, musicians are unique people. Engineers are unique people. That because of that ability to or that desire for the ultimate sound. And we do have a lot of stories about audio in here, and we'll tell you a few of them. But the important thing before we get into some of those stories is it's important to note that the artist needs to create the sound largely in the recording studio. That's where they're playing, right? But where they do most of the art is in the control room, right? Where they go into that control room where they have a playback where they experience it in a quote unquote stereo or quadraphonic or Atmos experience that you can't compare to at home because you can't afford it, right? Building that control room so the artist can really hear their music, experience the music, play with their music, adjust their music, add effects to their music. That's where much of the art takes place. And, since we're talking about blowing up speakers, Bonds, you got to tell the story because this is, move forward a year or so. Calgary and Stone, New York is a huge hit. Hendrix is blown the studio up. Everybody wants to get in there, and they realize the business is happening in LA, and they build their second studio in LA, which is where the music is happening. And in comes one of their friends, and then one of the greatest producers of all time, a guy named Bill Zimzik, with a band called James Gang. And Bonds, why don't you tell him this story because it's a great one.
Well, the relation. This is again something crucial to the meaning of this book is the relationship in this case between Bill Zimzik, who I interviewed on stage at the NAMM show a couple of years ago with Joe Walsh. They were old buddies. So this is before the Eagles, and they were recording a song for Joe Walsh's album called "The Bomber," and it
It's a James
required
Gang, rides again.
Yep.
it required a listening environment that these guys wanted, which was like about 10 gigantic tannoy monitors mounted up in the control room so that they could play it back at full volume. That's what the way they tested and listened to the music, and they hoped that people would experience it like it was a live concert, really loud, probably too loud. And every day they would blow out the speakers. One speaker would just start smoking and fall off the shelf, fall off the wall.
I
And
would have loved to have seen that.
so Stone comes in and says, What's going on here?" And Simzik says, "Look, we blew out some speakers again. We need some, okay, don't worry about it. They had a big supply of these speakers in the back room." And Stone would just say, "Oh, well, that's okay. The record company will pay for it." And so this went on for a long time. It was getting out of hand. But there was and Marty can tell you more about Tom Hidley, who I met and interviewed like 40 years ago. He was the mastermind with so many sonic advances in the studio beyond anybody else. So he was asked by Stone and probably Kellgren too, because it was his studio, and Bill Simzik, can you just build a monitor that Bill and Joe can't blow up? So Hidley does it. He builds the monitor that now there's still a kind of a worldwide standard for listening to critical listening, they call it, in the studio. Westlake monitors, and that was, I guess, the key to part of the advances in sound. You could get louder in the record plant than you could get any other place
You had to
in the
get loud.
world, probably.
It had to get loud and low, and in that control room. And Hendrix heard. Hendrix was working with Stone and Kellgren, or working with Kellgren at Record Plant New York. Went out to L.A. to work at a studio called TTG with an engineer named Tom Hidley, and he heard these loudspeakers, these studio monitors. They blew his mind. He went back to New York and told Kellgren and Stone about it, and they got on the next plane to hear him. And when they met this engineer, they said, "We got to hire him. He can, he's got the secret juice. He can put us in business." Kellgren was an amazing artist, a creative person. Stone was an amazing business guy, but Hidley brought that engineering, science to what they did, and the monitors that he built for Bill Zimzik and Joe Walsh and the James Gang became, like David said, the Westlake monitors. They're over 1,000 studios worldwide over the years.
Wow.
And if you tie that studio design that he built with Gary Kellgren, that was launched originally in Studio A in Los Angeles when they moved out there, that monitoring system is really something that ties together every record beyond Record Plant. And if you talk just about Record Plant, 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago this year, Springsteen in August, coming up August, it'll be 50 years for Born to Run, recorded on those same monitors in New York. You got
Wow.
Toys in the Attic with Aerosmith, same monitors in New York. You got rock and roll, John Lennon's rock and roll, done in LA and done in New York. You've got One of These Nights with the Eagles, done on those monitors in LA. You've got so many of these songs were done, and those, going back to your point, Randy, was being able to listen in a unique environment, acoustical environment like that on those speakers was mind-blowing. And that's, to a great extent, was the success of Record Plant. Not only did they serve the artist, but they provided them with a sound experience they couldn't get anywhere else.
Do you think? Oh, go ahead, Bonds.
Well, you can pick up on this if you want, but that relationship between Bill Simzik and Joe Walsh, probably 2 years later, or not too long afterwards, led to Joe joining the Eagles
The Eagles.
because they wanted to rock and roll. And Simzik was very good friends with their former producer, Glenn Johns, in England. And they left there because without finishing the album, because they wanted to rock and roll. But Bill Simzik, as a gentleman, and we're in touch with still all the time, he says, "Well, I'd love to produce, but I've got to talk to Glenn." So he calls Glenn Johns up in England and says, "Glenn, I'm with the Beatles. I mean, with the Eagles. They want they want me to produce." And Glenn Johns said, "Well, better you than me, mate." And that was it. He said he thought that he treated them as a vocal band, and they wanted to rock. And of course, who's going to help them rock better than Joe Walsh? And that deal came together in a steakhouse behind the studio. You could walk down the alley to this famous steakhouse where Stone had his own table, even had a telephone. If there was a problem at the studio, it was, I think what did they call it, Marty? Studio E.
Yeah, the entourage. I can't remember, it was Entourage or something. But yeah, it was
Yeah, so that's where the deal came down, and the test period for Joe Walsh, and then of course, the iconic Hotel California, uh, which has nothing to do with Record Plant, by the way. No, nothing at all. Of course not. There are no
wait.
Okay.
Good setup there.
Yes, there are bedrooms. There are bedrooms. There are mirrors on the ceiling. There's champagne on ice. Oh yeah, there's a few things, few similarities
We can get into
that
that.
album.
We can get into when you're ready, Randy.
Anytime. Hey, I've got all the time in the world. Let's let it rock, man.
Well, listen, before we get there, all right, all right, so we started the picture in New York, right, on 44th Street, New York with Hendrix. They move out and to LA. They don't give up New York. New York still, they need to hire a guy in New York to run it. So they find this engineer by the name of Roy Cicala. And Roy Cicala was one of those engineers in New York who could do anything. He could fix the equipment, he record, he could manage a crew, right? So they got Cicala running New York for them. And Cicala is not only an amazing engineer, but he's a great mentor. And his real skill set is not only to be able to run a studio, but and to run a session, but to train young people. And the best thing about studios, not only do they depend on tape and they depend on equipment and they depend on cheap, young, hungry kids who are willing to work for $1.25 an hour just to get close to the music, right? Well, under the tutelage of Gary Kellgren and under the tutelage of people like Roy Cicala, many of those people many of those youngsters who started $1.25 just to get the artist, became very famous engineers and later producers. And, at least in one case, Jimi Iovine, who, obviously many people know from his Beats headphones days as a billionaire, started as an assistant runner at Record Plant. So a lot of these young people became really sophisticated. And it all started with Kellgren and Stone. They had to come up with a business model, right? They had to come up with all right, you know what? We got one room. It's busy. Let's build a second room, right? Right? And then let's build a third room. And the more rooms, the more artists, the more money you're making, right? But there was only one Kellgren. There was only one Cicala. So Stone is in a dentist one day, right? And Stone's always coming up with the business model, right? Always figuring out how to turn time into money, which is studio time into money. That was his business, right? And he sees that the dentist comes in, takes a look, disappears, and the hygienist is doing all the work, and then comes back in, and boom, it was all the shuffle. He said, "Wait a minute, this dentist's got 5 rooms, exam rooms going, but he's popping from all 5, and he's got assistants, and he's got helping him out. So I'm going to hire a bunch of kids." Train them how to keep the console and the tape machine running so that, the Kellgren, the star, and Cicala, the star, could get things rolling, right? That business model transformed the studio business, because there weren't so many great A-list engineers out there. There were tons of young, cheap, hungry kids who who wanted to do anything to get close to the artist.
And
And
they
that's
learned quick too.
Do you think is the environment such today that that is still happening or could still happen, or is AI going to make that never happen?
Well, first of all, let's fast forward the story to now. All right, Record Plant, New York is long gone. It
Right,
was gone in the mid '80s. All right,
right.
there is still a room. One of the original rooms on 44th Street is still there on the 10th floor of that building on 44th Street, 321 West 44th Street. It's owned by Sony Music, and it's used to master their old records and bring them, re-release them. Okay.
Hmm.
The LA closed in the mid 80s. All right. But it moved to a new location. Stone moved it to a new location on a street called Sycamore. And it was open and functioning very successfully until last year. I mean, artists like Guns N' Roses, Beyonce, Kanye West, you can go on, Justin Bieber, all recorded there, post Stone and post Kellgren. And so it was around. The only real record plant studio from the beginning was the third that Kellgren built, which was his masterpiece and was built to sort of compete with Jimi Hendrix and Electric Lady Studios in New York, and that was his studio in Sausalito, a magnificent studio that he built with these artists, redwood artisans, and beautiful work there. That studio still exists, and it's been reborn. Good news. We talk about it. You can record with AI, and can record with assistants. You can record with a laptop. Well, you know what? You can't record in the Gary Kellgren original recording studio anywhere but Sausalito, where there's a new group of folks who are trying to bring it back home, and it is up and running. And we're going to see it later this week again, hopefully. And I've been there. It's an amazing place, and these guys are trying to keep it going. So. It's an expensive way to record, and it's maybe to some extent a time gone by, but it's not gone. There still are some large studios. There are fewer than there ever were, but there's still some of them out there. Thank
While,
Well,
goodness.
you,
while we're talking about Sausalito, why are we going to be up in Sausalito this Friday, the 25th, Marty? We're going to be signing the book. I'm just plugging on, and we're hoping that the Sausalito scene is very different than Los Angeles. That's Marin County. And we're hoping that there's still quite a few people up there that recorded
oh
at
yeah.
Record Plant. Uh, you know
One of
somebody?
my one of my first interviews I did after I launched Boomerocity was over in oh crap, I'm forgetting the town. I was in San Jose for business and I drove up. It's where Santana also kind of lives, and I met up with Sam Andrews, the big brother in the holding company,
Oh, yeah.
and just I mean, such a still almost like one giant commune over several towns and cities, right? Very very hip. The vibe is definitely there, but yeah, I mean, how cool is that Sausalito's
Yeah,
Still
we're
still
looking
exists.
forward
happening?
to
And
it.
obviously, and it gets, of all the record plants, and New York was, Hendrix, Lennon, Springsteen, Aerosmith, Kiss, I can keep going, right? LA, and we'll get into the Hotel California story, in a minute. Big place for the Eagles with Zimzik working there. Sausalito was claim to fame was Rumors, and
Yeah.
Fleetwood Mac Rumors. It's 1976. Just to give you an example of how successful, Kellgren and Stone's business model became in less than 10 years. They started in the spring of '68. By '76, they had 3 studios functioning round the clock with multiple rooms. They had recording trucks running around the country recording concerts, and so that they could put it in vinyl, right? And LA became crazy, not crazy, but let's say it got to be a bit of a party scene, right? And there were times when the artists wanted to
Just a
get out of
tad.
that scene. And so Stone and Kellgren went up to Sausalito by the bay and found this old warehouse and built their third studio. That's where Mick Fleetwood brought the band up, Fleetwood Mac up there to record their most famous record, Rumors. All right. And now there are tons of stories about the making of that record, which we could talk about in a minute. But there were three albums that during 76 that were Record Plant Studios recorded, and they accounted for almost 100 million albums sold. They were three albums: Hotel California by the Eagles, Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, and Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. All Record Plant albums, all happening at the same time, all owning the top of the Billboard charts all at once. That was the top of the charts for Record Plant, 76, when that happened. And the story of Sausalito is an interesting one, possibly, no, clearly Fleetwood Mac's biggest album, but also its biggest song, Dreams, was recorded there. And the story of how Stevie Nicks recorded Dreams is a fascinating one. And it's a bit of a rewind. Kellgren built that studio, but he also built a very odd room for Sly Stone. Sly was a big customer. Sly was a troublemaker. He was a brilliant artist, but he, had his own way of thinking. And he wanted Kellgren to build a studio up in Sausalito that was a hole in the ground. He didn't want to be a studio. He didn't want to be looked through the glass in the room. He wanted to be able to look up at the musicians sitting on the ledges. So he built Kellgren, always serve the artists, always give them what they want, right? And Stone saying if he can afford to pay for it, give it to him, right? So Sly could afford to pay for this odd design. They built a room called the Pit in Sausalito. And the Pit was not only an interesting place, but it really acoustically was a difficult environment to record in. And it may have served some artists. Bill Wyman from the Stones recorded there. Van Morris recorded in there. Of course, Sly Stone recorded in there. But it never really had a major hit come out of the Pit, except for one Fleetwood Mac song, Dreams. And the story is that, those famous Rumor sessions were kind of crazy. The band was breaking up. Their love affairs were falling apart. They were struggling with drugs and art. There's been books. There was a book, Ken Kelly, the producer, wrote a book, his own book, just about the making of that album. But during the making of that album, Stevie Nicks has an idea for a song, and she wanders off in the studio, and she gets lost in the maze of Record Plant and ends up in the Pit. Now, the Pit not only was a studio, but they built a private bedroom for Sly off the side with curtains with giant lips on it, a round bed with a velvet bedspread, a patch base so Sly could lay in bed and plug in and record. And she got on Sly's bed, crossed her legs, and took out a little keyboard and a little tape recorder. And it was in 10 minutes on Sly Stone's bed at Record Plant Sausalito is where Stevie Nicks wrote and recorded the first demo of Dreams. Wow. So that's kind
and it's still there, right?
No, that room is the studio's still there. That room is long gone.
Oh, okay. Wow. That's what I love about our music, man. There's all these cool stories about how it all happened, the quirks, the flukes that made things, that sparked creativity. And then, lives were touched, millions were made, and legends were born, those kinds of things.
You touched on something that's very important about Record Plant. It would when there was simultaneously in different rooms in New York or Los Angeles or Sausalito, in one room you've got Mountain, Leslie West cutting a record, and who's in the other room, Marty? The Who. I mean, it's the guys would walk down the hall and they'd go, "Hey, that sounds pretty good. Maybe we can get him to get up to play on our record." And so they'd say, "Hey, why don't you come in here and just lay down a mandolin track or something?" Yeah. You could have ideas like this spontaneously create a much bigger, more a deeper emotional experience with new blood coming into your room with some new ideas, and probably not no lawyers around to immediately stop. It was a free for all, and and you talked about the bedrooms. Well, that was again Stone saying, "Look, if they want to, you can get a you can get a hotel room and leave the studio, but you might stop working on your record. So, let's have some bedrooms here where you can relax and recuperate." Uh,
Well, let's
and
dig
Billable
it.
time, of course.
Let's
and,
dig it.
and,
Let's
and
dig
you
into
need a
that point.
choice too, because you can have the sissy room, which is really fluffy chiffon bedspread and curtains and, very romantic. And then you could have the boat room, which is kind of like you're leaving the studio, you're going underwater. You've got portholes, here you can be in the boat room. I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but there was a rack room, and it had wooden devices and ropes from the ceiling.
And 50
And
Shades of Grey, right? So,
Yeah, that's it.
well, what again, Stone, whatever floats your boat.
mhm.
Hey, I think this is where we should sort of address the whole. We've sort of alluded to it. We've teased this part of the story, right? Let's just dig into it right now. Was Record Plant LA Hotel California? Okay. There are lots of people who say absolutely it was Hotel California. That's where Henley and Glenn Fry came up with the idea. They were, this is all they wrote about Record Plant, right? And a lot of it's because there were hotel rooms at Record Plant LA, and David just described three of them, right? Um, and clearly the Eagles were encamped at Record Plant LA while they were writing that song. Clearly they were inspired and possibly to some extent by the environment of Record Plant. There was a night man who stood at the front of the front gate, quote unquote, or the front door, and you had to be buzzed in. Words, and that's the name of our book, is "Buzz Me In." That got you in the door, right? And you could check in, but you could never leave. That was Stone's business model all along. We want repeat business. We want these artists to keep coming back, right? And many of them did always keep coming back. The LA was built with these long, narrow, odd hallways, and it had sort of an LA Mexican vibe to it. There was a courtyard that was basically the parking lot, which wasn't quite a courtyard; it was a parking lot. There was a jacuzzi, right, where all kinds of shenanigans took place, and there were hotel rooms. There was one of those hotel rooms had mirrors on the ceiling, right? So there was a Rolling Stone journalist who went up to Don Henley once and said, "Hey, you know what? Once and for all, tell us, was Record Plant Hotel California?" And he said, "Absolutely not, besides the fact that some of the songs were written there." He said, point blank, it wasn't. And you know what? I'm not going to say it was Hotel California. I think it's a piece of art. Was it anything? Was it inspired by that environment that Stone and Kellgren built? Was it inspired by those rooms and that constant craziness of being locked in an environment where you have to create, where there's all sorts of things go on? I think it was clearly an inspiration, and so does many of the people who worked there. It was always clear that Stone and Kellgren had a vision for a rock and roll hotel. That was
And it
always
was
the
safe.
concept.
It was always safe. So, and the only studio where you could lock the doors on the inside. Nobody could get in. You were protected. Stone had his relationship with the local police. They would come by every night at around 2 o'clock. Everybody in the studio know that the local police are going to come by to sniff around, and they're probably going to enjoy the 25-cent beer from the beverage machine. And maybe they'll, lean in and they'll hear a little bit of maybe Joe Cocker in the background or Stevie Wonder. They're just checking to make sure there's no trouble. Okay, everything's okay here. We'll see you tomorrow. And then, bam, back to business and back to recording. and back to sometimes those shenanigans that Marty alluded to. But that's inevitable at that time. These guys were under so much pressure to
Yeah.
make their next hit. And, I used to manage a studio and I was an engineer. It seems kind of ridiculous and funny afterwards, but it gets so intense. When your career is on the line, you'll do anything to get that song.
There was only one other thing I'd like to add about the Hotel California thing. Okay, it was clear, like I said a moment ago, Stone and Kelvin always had the idea of renting out hotel rooms to rockers. That was always a part of the original business model when they started the place. They built those hotel rooms in the back of Record Plant LA, and they even went so far a year before that song was released to do an interview to show some of those hotel rooms to the general public in a feature article in People magazine, where they told the public that that was their business model. And what were they? What was their business? Their business basically was to rent rooms to rockers. I don't care if that's a studio with $100,000 console and a quadraphonic sound system. They were renting the rooms. Having a hotel room was a lot cheaper and a lot easier to rent than one of those rooms. So that was their business model. Stone always considered himself to be a bit of a concierge. His job was to always serve the artists and provide them with whatever they want. Bonds always says, whatever floats your boat, right? Well, that was his job, right? So I think the hotel, image, the hotel aesthetic was very much part of the business plan. And whether or not Hotel California was written about the studio, I'll say it wasn't. Did it inspire the song? I will say I'm not the writer, I'm not the artist, but I'll say there's a lot of evidence to prove that it was.
Well, it sounds like too, Hotel California is LA's American Pie. It's because everybody's
Yeah.
trying to figure out the song, right?
Well,
So
and
Yeah,
by the
here's
way,
the
American
here's
Pie was let's
that was
just
New York. Before we go to New
American Pie was
York
recorded in
from
New York.
Before we go to New York, there's a funny story about the Eagles at Record Plant. Bill Simzik had to keep these guys under control. And if you have an original copy, vinyl copy of Hotel California, you can look at the last groove on the record, which is where the mastering engineer would scribble the code number so that they could identify which batch this record came from. And Simzik, because he liked to follow the record from the beginning all the way to the end to mastering, he realized that he could write something there in addition to AX 7241. And so he scribed on the record, and it was pressed with every album, is it 6 o'clock yet? And now that's because there was a rule that Simzik, and they called him the coach. He was a big man. He's about 6'4". And his rule was, okay, we're going to get started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when you guys finally wake up. And there's going to be nothing except Coca-Cola or tea until 6 o'clock. So it worked. They got in there, they got work done, and then after a couple of weeks or maybe a month, they start grumbling at around 4 o'clock. Okay, we're going to do another take, guys. And you hear one of the guys near his mic going, "Is it 6 o'clock yet?" And that ended up like the keynote of the whole album. But it did work until finally he had to take the band and get out of town to finish the record. But I mean, that's where it was created, and I don't think it could have been created in any other environment. It was provided for the band, and whatever they wanted, that's what they got. And that's where they did it.
David mentioned earlier they were serviced and they were safe. They felt protected. He mentioned that you could lock the doors so nobody can come in while during the recording sessions. There's another story about Sly Stone in Sausalito that we tell that illustrates the fact that the artist felt secure there. And here's Sly is in San Francisco and he gets busted, right? He and his
Well, he's being chased.
they get in their car, and he and his posse, they speed off over the Golden Gate Bridge to Where do they go? Where do they run away from the cops? They run away over the Golden Gate Bridge to Sausalito, and they pull up and run into Record Plant, where they think they're going to be safe, and that's where they think they can hide out from the cops. That's the only time that a record plant had been busted by the cops, when Sly Stone brought them over, followed them into the record plant. And there are stories told as the cops come in, and Sly's nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found, right? He came in, he disappears, right? The cops call, and one room, Joe Cocker's in one room, New Riders is Purple Sage is in the other room. They call the lawyer, Stone calls his lawyer, right? And the lawyers and the cops are searching. They go through one room to try to, and they go through the machine shop to see see if they can find it. They go into the kitchen and they see these herbs and they think it's weed, but it's not. But you got to read the story. But the interesting part of it is when Kellgren built Sly his pit and built him his little bedroom, he built him a hideaway under his bed. So Stone, where he could hide. So, and not only did he do that, he also built him an escape route out of there with a phony bookcase so he can get through. So not only did Sly run in there, right, but we think either he got out of there before anybody noticed, or during the whole time when the cops were in there trying to find him and find drugs, he was hiding under his bed the whole time. We don't know which one it was.
Straight out of the movies, man.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, it's such a scene because the lawyer, his name was Phil Ryan, and he was written up just about a story about him in Rolling Stone at that time. He was the rock and roll lawyer. This is the guy they call in the middle of the night. So and so is, oh God, you won't believe what happened. All right, and he would manage the situation. He would manipulate the situation, and quite a few careers were saved from the toilet by the rock and roll lawyer Phil Ryan, who I met with Stone. I interviewed the two of them together, and they'd start talking about something, and then they look over at me, and they told me Bonds. No, hey, Phil, no, let's not go there. No, he doesn't need to hear that story. But Phil Ryan was out in front of the record plant when the cops were arriving and trying to get in, and he stopped them and he said, "Please, just a second. I've just talked with the owner, Mr. Chris Stone. He's in Los Angeles. He is just he can't believe that there were drugs at his studio. And just give me a few minutes here and we'll get this figured out." He wants to cooperate completely. Meanwhile, inside, toilets are flushing. Things are being hidden under beds. Stuff is going on. And then when they come in, he directs them to the tech room where there's like 1,000 little drawers and boxes. He says, "I think the drugs are in here."
Oh, Lord.
So the guys are searching through these. Anyway, it's all got a happy ending, our book.
We interviewed over 100 people during that 10-year period, Randy. And, a lot of these stories came from them. They were corroborated. There were different versions of them. There were some that, that we couldn't corroborate. A lot of it came from Stone, who, was gracious with his archives and certainly gave us the go ahead and gave us some of the most important parts of the storyline of the story. Right. But there were some stories that we tell that we really never could quite get straight. Right. And one of the big stories in our book that we decided to tell from a lot of different angles, like the movie Rashomon, where you don't really know what this story is, but you tell it from all different angles. And that's the story that historically took place in during John Lennon's Lost Weekend in Los Angeles when he was working with Phil Spector, and it was the night that people say that John was almost killed by Phil Spector,
By Phil, yeah.
producer. Now, those of you who may not know, Phil was one of the greatest producers of all time. Right, no question about it. Years later, obviously killed somebody with a gun and went to jail and spent the last years of his life in jail and had went through some crazy periods. But from his history at Record Plant and as a producer, a customer of Record Plant, and a producer for the post Beatles Harrison and Lennon in particular, bar none, one of the greatest achievements of all time. He started working with Harrison on the concert for Bangladesh, which was recorded by a Record Plant truck. He worked with John and Yoko on Imagine at Record Plant New York. And he went out west with John to record the rock and roll album at Record Plant LA, and went through one of his crazy periods. He always came into the studio, not always, but often came in the studio with armed, carried a gun with him. You know, there's a story that we tell that Gary Kellgren said to one of his assistants, if you see Phil Spector coming in with his heavy manila envelope, I'm out of here. Because he knew that Phil Spector used to carry the gun in his manila envelope. Well, one night, Phil and John were working on a song on the rock and roll album. They get into a bit of a tussle. They get into a fight. They leave the room. They go out somewhere in the studio, and everybody hears a gun go off, right? People start running towards the gun, see what's hell's going on. Now, this is where we hear a lot of different stories. Some say it never took place. It's rock and roll mythology. Never took place. Others say that they saw John holding his ears, that Phil had shot the gun so close to his head it really hurt his ears. Some said they were fooling around, but Phil went into the toilet and the gun went off when he was in the toilet by himself. Right? So we tell all the different variations. But a couple of things we do know for sure. One, Lennon confirmed that there was a shooting during the session by Phil Spector because he told the story in an interview years later. All right, and we also know that years later there were these beautiful wooden walls in Stone's office that was adjacent to the jacuzzi and the canteen. Right, gorgeous paneling, really, and when they tore down 3rd Street, the LA studio, those planks of wood, somebody said, you know what? One of the assistants said, you know what? Those will come in handy one day. I may build the studio again. I want to help. They kept them in his garage. Years later, there was a need for them. And he started planing them to clean them up for building. And he took this plane and he hit something hard. And he hit something else. He finds bullet shells in the wall. Whoa. So we do know that a shooting took place at Record Plant, and we do know enough evidence that there was this thing that took place. Now, the exact angle, we can't tell you. We can tell you that 7 years before John was ultimately killed from a gunshot, that he either came very close to getting shot and killed by Phil Spector at Record Plant LA.
Wow. Now, I forget which album it was, but an attorney for Lennon wrote a book a couple years ago having to get John out of some sort of legal bind over a record, but he didn't go into the whole thing about that. It'd be interesting to get see if he has any insight to any of that. But anyway, that's fascinating. Do you find you guys have been in more studios than I've been? I've only been in one, and it was a Christian studio in Nashville that I don't even think is there anymore. But talking with artists, and I've talked to some who have been like to Muscle Shoals, the Fame Studios, interviewed, Hall that owned it before he died. These guys, I mean, there's just all this history there. You've got, the Abbey Road Studios, all that. Friends of mine have recorded there. When we talk about this audio patina that seems to be in these places, does that resonate with you? Is that something that you would agree to, that when you walk in, you could, like I go to Dealey Plaza in Dallas, you can just feel the historic patina there in Dealey Plaza.
Absolutely.
Do you find that in the studios?
Absolutely. I've been a studio rat for many, many years. And, there's just something, there's a studio in Hollywood called United. It was built by Bill Putnam, who was instrumental in the first multi-tracks and worked with Les Paul and all. And, there's a magic in that, those acoustics. A lot of it is the wood, the fabrics on the walls, the additions. It might be I think Stax in Memphis. It might be the crazy acoustic tiles on the walls that are somewhat reflective but somewhat absorptive. It may be these weird linoleum floors, tile floors from the 50s. But once it happens and you got that sound, it is magic, and you can feel it, and you can go, "Oh my God, I'm Frank Sinatra recorded in this room, Bob Dylan recorded in this room." You can clap your hands, and you can go, "Whoa, there's something here in these rooms."
Yeah.
Some people call them, the temples of sound, but there is something to that. And there are some guys, Tom Hidley in our book, who were masters of creating an acoustic room where, you had flexibility. You could do a lot of different things, mic placement, in the corners, close to the instruments, multiple microphones, amplifiers put into this side isolation room. It is a magic place. You can't do that in your bedroom. You got a plug-in now that can sound like whatever studio you want. And again, because it's in a different environment, you don't have multiple musicians actually, you know, working at the same time, making that music, listening to each other, getting that exchange going in the room, that reverberation affecting the sound that's going to finally end up on it going into the microphone and then being recorded on either tape or Pro Tools or digital. Yeah, it's precious stuff.
And I think that's the digital age, and we've talked a lot about the analog age, and our book goes roughly from 67 to 80, and just the birth, digital was just coming out first time, and far before, and even then, digital tape machines were a fortune. Now you can record on a laptop in your living room or your bedroom. But and clearly the early days of digital analog sounded better. There's some people who still say 2-inch, 16-track analog is the best sounding recording you can possibly get. But there was one thing that digital changed besides the soundtrack. It allowed people to phone in their parts. It allowed them to work remotely. Bands stopped working together, in a room, in a studio all at once. They started, doing their parts from their houses, working remote, sending files all over the world. And if anything has changed the music, and if digital has changed the music in many ways, listen, digital has changed the way we experience it on our phones and on Spotify, whatever. But the biggest change was how that music is made. And one thing that it has lost is that collaborative experience of working in a room, like David
The
expressed.
camaraderie. Yeah.
The camaraderie, that band playing together in a room.
That's what I was going to mention to you, because it seems like artists that I've talked to a lot in especially last couple of years. And to your point about analog, I think Joe Walsh even came out with an album 10 or so years ago called Analog Man, and he recorded to tape, and but talking with especially blues artists, man, they love getting into those studios, and it could be some rinky-dink studio somewhere that most people haven't heard, but they love facing each other. Yeah, they might have some baffles put up around their amps or around the drums or whatever, but they're able to look at each other. They're able to feed off of each other. Again, not being a musician, but just even thinking if it was a conversation going on, just being able to have that interaction. There's something about being in the room together. And I hope, and this was something I was going to ask you guys. I mean, and it kind of goes back to one of the questions I asked earlier. you know, okay, so we have all this technology. Do you ever think it'll ever get back to where, now, first of all, I don't even like the new music coming out unless it's from blues and certain rock bands, certain classic rock bands. I mean, the newer genres of music, they've lost me. But to get guys together,
Me
to be
too.
able to just to hear these people be able to do true musicianship,
Oh, it's
and
not gonna disappear. What you're
I
hearing
hope
and what
not.
you're thinking will survive in some place. And you're right, it can be this out of the way studio. But I got to tell the one story about collaboration in the studio between the musicians. It isn't always super friendly.
No.
If you've got two guitar players on Hotel California, and you've got Bill Simzik feeding the fire to get these guys to compete with each other. Those two guitarists, um, and he would separate them, and he'd get one guy to go in. Okay, can you do better than Joe? Yeah, sure. And that's how when I still get chills listening to Hotel California because of that, because and we document it in our book. We tell the story. That result of that competition and that really fierce, oh yeah, okay, there's an artistic anger there that you can't get if you're just sitting alone going, well, I can do this or I can do that. That's a chemical thing between human beings. And if you've got the right equipment to capture it, there it is. You can feel it, you can hear it.
Studio, the most famous, most successful studio record plant, any record plant, was a small room in LA, Studio B. It was not A. It was not the premier room. It wasn't C, the giant room. It was B. It just so happened to be a small room where Stevie Wonder encamped in the early 70s with two of his producers and one of the early synthesizers, which he called Tonto, right? And where he recorded four albums that are now defined as his classic period, and recorded over 300 of the greatest songs of all times, many of which are not even released, right, in Studio B, because it had this magic mojo. And it's in that room where Stevie, with his two producers, the guys named Malcolm Cecil and Bob Margoliff, worked and recorded with Tonto, his synthesizer, and they, like David's discussing, it had that magic. It had that magic touch. It wasn't the biggest room, maybe not even the best room, but boy, what a hit making machine that Stevie was in that room. And when you have a room that creates music like Stevie Wonder's greatest hits, all right, that studio became a real draw. It may not have been the fanciest room, may not have been the biggest room, but it had that magic mojo. Because remember, artists are unique, and I'm not an artist. I don't know if you are or artists listening right now, but they don't know where their next hit's going to come from. There's a lot of insecurity going into making art. You're pushing the boundaries of things. You're trying something new. You don't know. If you have a hit, it's even worse. The pressure to create another hit is, am I going to be a one-hit wonder? When you take the unexpected out of it, when you do it where in a room and a place where a lot of magic takes place, that superstition falls in, right? And superstition was recorded at Record Plant, by the way, Stevie Wonder. So superstition is a very unique thing when it comes to artists, and that's why artists checked out, but they never left Record Plant because they were afraid of losing that magic mojo,
Yep.
and they needed it because there's always, like David says, there's a lot of pressure for another hit.
Yep. Well, we talked a lot about Hendrix earlier, and especially at the beginning of this chat. Our good friend Bob and Ben Merlis, they handled Janie Hendrix, masterfully handling the Hendrix estate. Wonderful woman to talk to. To your knowledge, because of all the stuff that was done at Record Plant, do you think that there's still something like really big that's yet to be released that nobody's heard of yet from Hendrix?
I don't, I can't imagine. Although, listen, I can't imagine the Hendrix stage has done a beautiful job at mining that archive. They compare people have compared those tapes that Hendrix recorded in those long all-night jam sessions that are recorded there. Um, they compare them to like Charlie Parker's Savoy sessions or Picasso's sketchbooks.
Mm-hmm.
People complained early on that maybe Stone and Kellgren were taking advantage of Kellgren because they were running tape. He was running so much tape. Remember, that tape was expensive. It was $100+ for every reel, and they ran a lot of tape, and he spent a lot of time there. People said, were they taking advantage of him? It turns out not, because you know what? Those tapes that only I think the Hendrix estate knows knows about.
Well, we're
Certainly
friends
on a
with.
whole posthumous, all the posthumous albums came out,
I think it's
from those
possible. I
tapes.
think it's entirely possible. There was a lot of stuff recorded there, and we're friends with, Jimmy's engineer, um,
Eddie.
and he at the time he thought, Record Plant was just, burning tape, but time has proven him, and now he's very grateful.
Yeah.
We're talking about Eddie Kramer.
Right.
But as far as another example, Stevie Wonder. I mean, there must be hundreds of 2-inch tapes that we haven't heard yet.
Well,
And we're
the
friends
tapes.
with his current engineer. He's in the book. We may get together on stage at NAMM next January to talk about
Cool.
uh, songs in the key of life. No, there's still, it's not over yet. It's like archaeology. And finding that tape, that outtake, that alternate version of the record that we've grown to love over 50 years. Oh, it's entirely possible. Don't give up.
Hey, you know what? And David's right, because you were talking specifically about Hendrix, but think about the hundreds and hundreds of artists who recorded there, right? And tapes weren't necessarily locked down. They're sitting in people's basements, and old engineers may have taken a 2-track back, and they didn't all show up in the most legitimate places. There are some bootlegs that have circulated over the years that were from some of those Record Plant sessions. The most famous of which was that took place in 1974 in L.A. and it's considered the last time that Paul McCartney and John Lennon played together in the studio. Was it
Mm.
in a bootleg that came out because it leaked, because it got out of the studio, and it was a jam session that includes not only the two Beatles, but Stevie Wonder showed up for it. It's
Wow.
called
Wow.
Toot and Snore in '74. You can watch it on YouTube or listen to it on YouTube. It's awful. It sounds like crap. It's embarrassing. It's the kind of thing no artist ever wants to get out there, but it got out there. So some of those tapes are may come out. I know not everybody's as buttoned up as the Hendrix estate either,
Yeah.
but
True.
those tapes are out there.
Do you know of any Record Plant tapes that wound up being lost in that big warehouse fire that where so many masters were destroyed a few
Oh,
years
that
ago?
was, that was near here in
Universal
Hollywood.
Fire, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there's I don't know that, but I can tell you another story that in Gary Kellgren passed away, drowned in his swimming pool in summer of '77. Actually, this summer, in July 20th, he passed away, and he in January '78, Studio C was the big room in LA. And all of a sudden, one day, there's a fire breaks out in the studio. And that fire gets out of control. Now, a fire in a studio is a big deal, okay? But it's even a bigger deal when you have Songs in the Key of Life in the tape archive, when you got Hotel California masters in the archive, when you've got so many master tapes that are irreplaceable in a studio.
Mm-hmm.
So the studio, here are the fires going on. The cops are out. The fire engines are coming down. And and you think everybody's going to run for the hills? No, record plant's employees were trained. And there was Al Cooper, the famous musician and producer there, working with an artist, and he gets all these young people to form a what do you call it? A gang, right? They start at the Ark and they
Like
start
like a bucket brigade.
a bucket brigade,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And a bucket with all those masters getting passed through the studio. Eventually, C was destroyed. Eventually, almost all of the studio was, and much of the equipment was saved, but every single tape was survived. And that's
Wow.
because you do despite the fact that this major studio room burned to the ground, they saved the tapes. And they knew Cooper and everybody at Record Plant knew they had to save the studio, and they had to save their lives. But more important than the studio and more important than their lives was saving those tapes.
Those
That's a lesson learned.
Wow.
Yeah,
What-
we've got a picture in the book with Cooper, pushing like a kid's wagon down the street loaded with these 2-inch tapes. I mean, he didn't want to go back and try to do that again.
He couldn't. It would never be exactly the same.
No.
Was there anything that didn't make it into the book that you wished had?
No.
We get asked that question a lot. I'm sure
But there are some things that Stone didn't want to tell the stories about anybody he didn't want to tell any stories that would hurt other people.
Right.
And we respect that. And invariably, we heard a few things, we didn't even want to dig into it. Stone took care of the artists, and that included, if necessary, the legal power that he could wield. I mean, he had lawyers. He had different kinds of lawyers. And actually, I still know one of his lawyers, the one he called his bulldog lawyer. That's the guy you call in a hurry and get somebody to take care of things in a hurry. But he was friends with the most powerful lawyers in town, and he protected people. He saved careers in that way occasionally. So occasionally there were instances where people, got a little carried away in the bedrooms, and he had doctors that could come in at any time of day or night and take care of the artist and bring them back, to health again. But we didn't want to dwell on some of those things.
Right.
I'll tell you one thing and it's not exactly what you're looking for, but women. It was a different era with the rock stars and groupies.
Oh, yeah.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And we say sex, drugs, rock and roll, and audio as being that's the theme of our book. But women, a lot of the groupies were mishandled, let's say to speak, and it was, women were.
But that was not only a record plant. That was the things that
Yeah,
were going
right.
on.
That was rock and roll. Yeah.
But Record
It
Plant was
was.
unique in the fact that it was funded by a woman named Anki Revson, a woman who bankrolled it. She bankrolled hair before she bankrolled Record Plant. Many of the women became famous engineers. Many of the women became studio managers and became very successful business people. So I think it's important to note that the women played an incredibly important role in the success and operation of that studio, even in a very male, misogynistic environment of those times. And Stone and Kellgren made sure those women were credited and were very important ultimately to the success of the studio.
And we're still in touch with some of those ladies. And, they were the first women to ever really record and engineer hit records. Stone and Kellgren were very respectful of women. And it proved successful for them because of that. Stone always knew that the women were running the scene behind the scenes here in Hollywood and in the movie studios and in the recording studios. They knew what was going on. So that's part of the history that is very, very good.
Yeah. Well, when I asked the question, I wasn't meaning anything salacious. I mean, it's like I'll ask an artist the same thing about an album. Is there a song that didn't make it that you were hoping to? So if you see or watch any of my interviews, I don't go for the nasty stuff. I just let artists share what they want to, and try to keep things positive, and it's worked well for me over the years.
Really has. Congratulations. Hey, Randy, I'm sorry, David. I gotta head out. I gotta head out, unfortunately.
Well, and I was just getting ready to wrap it up too. Can I ask you two more quick questions, and you can keep it as short as you want? And that is, will this be turned into a documentary? And secondly, what's next for you guys?
Well, regarding documentary, we're obviously now this story is knocking the socks off many people, upper, lower, you name it, and we're starting to get a lot of interest in film and documentary. We've got enough for Ken Burns to make a 10-hour documentary. Cool. Believe me, we got it all on tape. And
we've got higher dreams, though. We want Martin.
Oh yeah,
David Chase to make it a TV series on. That's our goal, right? We spent 10 years on this. We want big time. And when you ask what's next, there's no taking this to a wider audience. Not everybody has the patience, ability to read a 350-page book with this amount of research. Telling it to a wider audience in multiple formats is our next plan for here, because the story needs to be told.
And an audio book. We're looking into that. Yeah. We've talked to the publisher about that. The book itself is really the springboard for a lot of things to come, and there are many other stories that we just have room for it in the. Yeah. But for those who want to follow it. There's lots more stories here to tell.
Yeah. Well, man, I can tell from you guys, I haven't even touched what I'd really like to sit down with you guys sometime, like over coffee or something, just talk about your careers as far as interviewing people and such, because obviously that's near and dear to my heart. And I was never in this business, and this has always been a labor of love and a fun passion for me, but I enjoy the heck out of it and can always learn from people. And
maybe we got a lot of stories, so call us again.
Yeah, let's plan on doing that. Let's do that. Anytime. And I'm in East Tennessee. If you guys are ever near the Smoky Mountains, that's where I live. And
it's beautiful there.
Oh, I love it. I'm a couple miles up the road from Dollywood, believe it or not.
Oh, that's great.
But let's definitely do this again. It would be fun.
We'll talk to you.
Thank you, Randy.
Happy to do that.
All right, really I'll drop Ben a note about that book. Okay.
You got it. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Y'all be safe. Take care.
You too. Thank you very much. Bye.